Men, it's time to rise up. You're called to lead with courage, labor with purpose, and love sacrificially like Jesus. The world needs men of action, warriors who advance, not retreat. Now is the time to stand firm in faith, be the man God has designed you to be, and make an impact for the kingdom. Are you ready to step up to the plate? Will you answer the call? This is Man Talk, the podcast promoting biblical masculinity.
Welcome to Man Talk, the podcast promoting biblical masculinity. Today we're talking about courage here in episode 6 of season 2, so stick around for the rest of the discussion. Well, we're so glad that you joined us. Remember to be following us on socials to keep up with where we're going. And also make sure you are subscribed on YouTube at Man Talk Pod, because that's where all of our video content is primarily hosted at. And that way you can get connected with the show better. Well, as I said, we're talking about courage today. And I want to give a quote here by the boxer, Muhammad Ali. He said this: "He who is not courageous enough to take risks will accomplish nothing in life." And that really sets us up today with this idea of courageousness is necessary. Courage is a necessary trait to have as men. We're in our mini series of essential masculine traits, characteristics that we should have as men, biblical men. And courage is one of those. We must have courage. Courage is a vital need in this day and age.
Well, John Wayne put it like this. He said, courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway. And I think there's some truth in that. We're not talking about an absence of all fear and an absence of all doubt, but we're talking about just go ahead and doing what we ought to do because we should be doing it. I believe we have an epidemic of male weakness. Male weakness. We're living in a time where we have strong women, weak men, and confused children. I also believe we have an epidemic of weakness in spiritual leadership. Somebody defined consensus as a stranglehold to progress in the church of God, and I believe that's exactly true. Now, when it comes to the home, a church, or a ministry, leadership is not a reflection of where things are. Leadership is not a restatement and an evaluation of where things are. Leadership is a prophetic declaration of where things ought to be. And this is what is sorely needed at this time. Now, we've seen this in denominations. The United Methodist Church recently had a massive split, which was 70 years or 80 years in the making, and a failure to deal with the moral issues and the doctrinal compromise led to a massive departure. These things should have been addressed, but there was a lack of prophetic declaration. Now, this is not only true in liberal denominations, but this is true in families, local churches. Leadership is not just looking around and saying, well, this is what everybody else is doing. No, leadership is a prophetic declaration of where things ought to be and how things ought to be.
I think what we're really trying to emphasize there is, as a part of leadership, one of the most dynamic characteristics is being courageous and having courage. The example you gave of the United Methodist denomination, well, it did take a while, and there was maybe a lack of courage in leadership at points to stay true to a certain orthodox theological positions, but there was courage that was shown by those who were finally willing to take a stand. And I think that that's what we are trying to emphasize, is that courage is needed. People need to step up in courage to do what is right, no matter the cost or consequences. And we should not be men who are gripped by fear. We should step out of our comfort zones and take a hold of courage in our lives. Courage is a must. And so we really want to define courage. We want to know what we're talking about here. And courage, according to Merriam-Webster, is the mental or moral strength to venture, persevere, and withstand danger, fear, or difficulty. It's not the absence of fear, as you've already said. No one will ever be absent of fear. Fear is going to be something that we deal with for the rest of our lives. However, courage is being willing to stand up in the face of fear, adversity, or trials and to do what is right, to have mental or moral strength to venture and persevere in the middle of fear.
Courage is fear that has said its prayers. Some wise person said that. Courage is fear that has said its prayers. Mark Twain put it like this: courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not the absence of fear. You know, when Columbus struck out into the ocean on a non-motorized boat with no map, I don't know if he had. I don't think he had a compass. I think he had the stars to navigate by. He didn't really know what was ahead of him, and I'm sure there was some apprehension. There must have been some apprehension. Nevertheless, here they go. They struck out and discovered the state. So here we are. Courage, and I believe he felt like he had a clear assignment from God. And you know, courage is based upon a clear purpose or direction or call or mission from God. And when we have that, then we can launch out with great courage. You know, Stephen, I think you could tell more about a man's leadership in a church after he leaves than while he's there. In other words, if he leaves messes behind that's going to cause problems, it was a lack of courage to deal with those situations. I know of a situation where a church had two splits. One was because of a failure to carry out church discipline in a moral issue, and when that came to light years later, that caused a departure, and then a doctrinal error going to seed on doctrine, and these things were left unchecked, and because of that, it caused problems, and the church split twice. Now, leadership is a prophetic declaration of where things ought to be. A prophetic declaration. So we've got to stop toning down our convictions and doctrine and belief to accommodate unsaved and unspiritual people. Leadership is a prophetic declaration, and I just sense that we're in a time when this has been downplayed, looked down upon. The whole idea of reproving and rebuking has pretty much been put to the wayside, and it's all on exhortation. And boy, we sure need to be taught, and we sure need to be encouraged, and we sure need to be exhorted, but there are times when a rebuke is called for.
And what it really comes down to is we need men of courage. I actually think that that's in our opening intro music and our intro to our show. We need men of courage. And sometimes we get courage and bravery confused. So we just want to make sure we make the distinction here. Courage is that mental strength or moral strength to venture and withstand, but bravery is often the quality or state of showing that mental strength. So we confuse them as the same thing. Really what it comes down to is courage breeds bravery. Courage is more of the interior. Bravery is more of the exterior, the showing of courage. So it's impossible to have bravery without courage. But you're probably not going to show any bravery if you don't have courage, is what we're getting at. And that's why we're attacking this topic of courage. We must be men of courage. Ambrose Redmoon defines courage as not having the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something else is more important than that fear. I really think that that is a key definition. I think of a practical just illustration of that in my own life. I remember growing up as a kid, I was always scared of the dark. I couldn't stand the dark. I needed a nightlight in my room when I was a young kid, and I always hated the dark, but I got into hunting somewhere along the way, probably when I was in middle school, going into high school, and I will never forget that first moment where I went by myself hunting in the morning, and I had to walk into the woods in the dark. And I remember for me, for a lot of people, that's not a big deal, but for me, that was a big deal. Why? Because I was facing my fear. And as I was walking, I had a gun, I was going deer hunting. I was not walking through the woods without fear. I was walking through the woods scared to death at that young age. But what I was doing was I was facing that fear. Why? Because I viewed something else as better than the fear. Me getting into the deer stand, being able to sit there, hunt, and have the potential to see a large buck and shoot it was bigger to me than the fear I was facing. And so I really do agree with that definition. Courage is not having the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something else is better.
When Moses died, God said to Joshua to step up and lead the nation. And here's what he told him: only be strong and very courageous. That's what God said to Joshua. Only be strong and be very courageous. In other words, he was to take the lead. This was not consensus. This was not figuring out what the children of Israel wanted to do. For crying out loud, they wanted to go back to Egypt at one point in time. No, God said, you be strong, you be courageous, and you are called to lead the nation. That was his assignment.
Yeah, and I think that illustration is actually a really good illustration, because I would imagine, if I'm just putting myself in Joshua's shoes, that he was at least a little nervous or a little anxious or a little worried about the potential of leading a nation of that extent. He went from being a leader in the nation to a leader of a nation. And overnight, when Moses died to where Joshua is, he has the weight of the world instantly upon his shoulders, the weight of a nation, so to speak. And God gave him very specific commands there. Be strong, courageous, and what else did he say? He said, follow the law. Follow what you know to do, what I have given you to do through Moses. Follow after me, basically, in our modern translation. So you, Joshua, can be strong and have courage. Why? Because you know what to do. You know who I am, so go and do it. And we need to, as men, be that way. We need to be convinced that following Jesus is better than the fears that we have. Following Jesus and doing what is right is better than the fears that we have. And we could keep on going with that analogy, but that is where we need to be as men who have courage.
In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, God said this: be on the alert, stand firm in the faith, and act like men. Quit yourselves like men. What does that mean? That means to conduct yourself in a courageous way. Act like a man, behave like a man, step up to the plate, be a man, and have courage. Conduct yourself in a courageous way. We have to be men of courage.
I think we could keep on going here with biblical examples of courage, and that would be great. But what I don't want to do is I don't want us to leave out without having some type of practical application in our life. And so we actually have 5 ways today that you can develop a life of courage. You might be listening to this or watching this and you're like, I don't feel very courageous. I don't have a lot of courage. Courage is something that has been absent from my life. And really, I think that as we transition here, it's important to understand that there is a lot of times a lack of courage. I think especially as younger men, I can speak to that, as when you're young, you do sometimes feel like you have a lack of courage because you don't necessarily have as strong of a confidence in who God is or who you are as a man. And I think it's important to recognize that. But what is super important is to get past that and to start today and developing courage in your life. So we want to give 5 ways that we can do that. And the first way that you and I, whoever's listening, whoever's watching, can develop a life of courage is this: that you would address your fears, that you would address your fears, that you would face them head on. We live in a broken world. We live in a world that is full of trials, problems, things to be afraid of, a lot of things we don't understand, that we can't explain or we can't fix. So fear is pretty much a given on a daily basis. There's a lot of things that we can be afraid of, but maybe instead of approaching life as there's so many things that we could be afraid of, we can view it on the flip side of the coin and look at it as there is so many opportunities for us to be courageous, because everything that we can be afraid of is an opportunity to show courage. And in order to develop courage, we must address our fears. We must face them head on. Don't sweep them under the rug. Don't try and ignore them. Don't try and act like a big tough guy that you don't have any fears. That ship has sailed. It's time to address our fears and look them dead in the face and to face them head on.
There's 2 acronyms for fear, FEAR. One is forget everything and run. FEAR, an acronym, forget everything and run. But the second one, face everything and rise. Face everything and rise. And that's what you're saying. We have to have the courage to face our own insecurities, our inexperience, our lack of wisdom, our past experiences, whatever, and just go ahead and face it and get on the ball and run and go for broke. We've got to be swinging for the fence. Churchill made a great statement. He said, courage is going from failure to failure without losing enthusiasm. Don't you like that? Going from failure to failure without losing enthusiasm. A just man may fall down 7 times, but he rises up again. And if we keep on getting up after we fall down, we're going to make it. And that's what courage is. It's going from failure to failure without losing our excitement, our curiosity, our initiative, and our enthusiasm.
And fear really is rooted in this inability to change things, I think, as a man. It's the inability to see the future, so we don't know what's going to happen, or it's the inability to change the present. And this feeling of powerlessness rises up in us, and we call that fear. And I think that also contributes to the evil cousins of fear, which are worry and anxiety, which if you just look at stats, even in men, it's ridiculous, the rise of anxiety, worry, and fear. So the presence of fear, we should probably understand, might not be the real source of the issue, though, if we're honest about it. Because at the root of fear, we just said, is the inability to change things or to see into the future. And really, as a Christian, what it comes down to is what we said earlier. Courage is viewing something that is more valuable than the things we are afraid of. And I think for a Christian, facing our fears is good. But we must look to the one who is above our fears. We must evaluate our source of courage. That's the second way that we can develop this life of courage. Not that we just focus on the fear, but that we change our minds and we begin to focus on the source of our courage, and that's God. We know the one who holds the future. We know the one who can change things in the present. So we must get to the point where we face our fears, but we evaluate our source of courage.
Courage is confidence in the character of God in times of crisis and times of uncertainty. So what is courage? It's confidence in the character of God. Maybe not much confidence in ourselves or other people or circumstances or the economy or the political party or anybody else, but confidence in the character of God. I think one of the Stoics said this. Listen to this one. He who loses wealth loses much. He who loses a friend loses more, but he that loses his courage loses it all. And we cannot afford to lose our courage. We have to evaluate the source. What are we dependent upon? It's confidence in the character of God in the hard seasons of life.
We have a lot of hard seasons. So I think it's important for the battered, bruised, and broken to remember this when your confidence is low. That's not a bad place to be. I think as men, sometimes we get to this place where we have little confidence in ourselves. And there is an element that we're going to talk about here in a minute about having some confidence. But really, not having a lot of confidence in yourself is not a terrible place to be, because that gives us the ability to place our confidence in the God of the universe. We have the backing, care, and concern of the King of the universe in our favor if we are Christians. And it's kind of that old analogy of when you're in school, right? If you have someone bigger than you, maybe an older brother or a father, accompany you to school to face the school bully, you're going to have more confidence. Why? Because you have the backing, care, and support of someone who is stronger than you. And in our case, the King of the universe has all the strength we will ever need. So he must be the source of our courage and not something that is fleeting.
In those low times of life, like I have a good friend, his wife died over a year ago. He's still struggling. That's okay. It'd be easy to pontificate, give 3 easy steps to solve the problem, get over it. You shouldn't be so anxious and so on and so forth, but that's not even realistic. And I think that courage is not the absence of doubt, not the absence of peace, not the absence of struggle. I mean, struggle is the evidence that you haven't given up yet. And so I believe that in those seasons of loss, when tremendous loss has come our way, and here we are struggling and battling, and we're depressed and whatever else, we need to understand that we can have confidence in God's character when we can't have confidence in anything else.
Thirdly, we need to continue on with these ways to develop courage. And it's not just addressing our fears. It's not just that we would evaluate our source of courage, but also that we would step outside of our comfort zone. We must take action. It's not enough to just face our fears, name them, address them. Yes, that's good. Evaluate our source of courage and have our confidence in God. Good. But when does that translate? Where does that translate to showing itself? What translates right here? You step outside of your comfort zone. You do things that aren't always comfortable. You do things in the face of fear and adversity. And that's where courage, I believe, is shown.
Someone said you can choose courage or you can choose comfort, but you cannot choose both. And I think that's the truth. I mean, everybody wants a nest without thorns. We would like a peaceful life with no problems, no difficulty, no conflicts, but that's not the way it's going to be. So we have to choose courage because comfort is pretty elusive in a lot of cases. Chesterton said, I believe in getting in hot water because it keeps you clean. And as long as we're in hot water where things are not pleasant, not comfortable, and not peaceful, not which we would like, that is a good place, and that's a purging place, that's a cleansing place, that's a refocusing place. And I believe that God will put us in these kind of situations as long as we're alive to keep our attention and our devotion and our confidence in Him and Him alone.
Well, and it really comes down to that, though, is that every day we are faced with something that is a comfort zone killer, something that is going to make us feel uncomfortable, or a fearful situation, or a potential to show courage. So I think as men, we must rise to the occasion instead of just sitting in our own little comfort zones and just rotting away, that we would stand up in courage. They did studies, I think, on the older you get, right? And the people who age the best are the ones who remain active, right? And that has been something that has been like a key thing, like that's been an agreed upon thing. And if you stay active, what are you doing? Well, you're getting outside of your comfort zone. You're choosing to get up in the morning, even though you probably have aches, pains, or you're super tired, and you're getting up instead of just sitting in your comfort zone and letting your muscles just atrophy away. And the same thing's true in life. We must step outside of our comfort zones. We must push ourselves and stand up in courage to face fear, to face all of these things, because those things aren't going to go away. They're going to stay, but we can rise above them with the help of God. The fourth way to develop a life of courage, or to have a life of courage, is to develop your skills. Always be a learner. Always be someone who is challenging yourself to grow and to learn. I think a great example of this is prayer. Prayer is literally God's lifeline for the fearful. But prayer is something that if you do not develop your prayer life, you're probably not going to be very confident in it. But the more you pray, the easier it is to pray. Why? Because you are developing that relationship with God. You are continuously speaking to God. And as you grow closer to Him and you speak with Him more often, it's easier to pray. Why? Well, because you developed that skill. And I know a lot of people are afraid of praying in public. But the only way to get over having a fear of praying in public is what? To develop that skill and to pray. And so I think this idea of developing skills is extremely, extremely important. And we must not discount it. I think back to when I was in college, I was a counselor at a camp, and I was always afraid of heights too. And the heights and the dark were my fears. And I remember I got put on the high ropes course to help run parts of that. And I remember the difference between me the first day of training on the high ropes course versus later in the summer running the high ropes course. I was much more comfortable later in the summer, and I was able to overcome my fear of being high up in the trees easier, to the point where I was helping a kid rappel down because he got scared and he panicked. Why? Why was I able to do these things? Well, because I developed my skills in that area. So therefore, I was able to show courage in an easier way.
And the fifth way to develop courage is to fellowship with the courageous. Get around people with vision. Get around people with ambition. Get around people that have initiative. Get around people that have courage. I think it was Thomas Watson said that association begets assimilation. Association begets assimilation. In other words, we're going to become like the people we hang around with. So we need to get away from the fearful and the unbelieving. That's the crowd that's going to be thrown in the lake of fire, according to Revelation. We need to get around people that have some courage. Now, bravery inspires other people. It inspires people. David's mighty men, when they went behind the lines of the Philistines to retrieve that water, I'm telling you, they inspired the other soldiers, and David inspired people as well. Now, the word encourage, we're talking about courage. The word encourage means to impart courage, to put strength in somebody else's heart. And, when we get around people that are ambitious and they have spiritual, holy, sanctified ambition, it inspires us, it motivates us, it moves us. I mean, you can't follow a parked car. You need to get around people that are going somewhere, doing something. Iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpeneth the countenance of his friend. So being around people like this is a tremendous incentive. Emerson made this quote. He said, "A hero is no braver than an ordinary man." A hero is no braver than an ordinary man, but he is brave 5 minutes longer. In other words, this element of perseverance, this idea of continuance, this idea of not giving up, this idea of keeping on. I'll tell you what, we need to get around people and get in fellowship with people that have courageous, because courage is contagious. Sadness is contagious. Disease is contagious, but happiness is contagious. And I'll tell you what, courage is contagious. When a man takes a stand and does the right thing, it strengthens the backbone of those that are looking on. So I believe it's absolutely imperative to fellowship, get around people who are courageous and attempting things and taking risk.
And really, you're speaking to this important principle that no man's an island and we need one another. And men, that's kind of a really area that we could probably all grow in, is the fact of being vulnerable and reaching out. And we talked a little bit about that last week and talking about honesty in our last episode. But we really need to be men of courage. And one of the best ways to do that is this idea of the discipleship of other people in our lives, and then being discipled, being poured into, being encouraged, the impartation of courage from others and to others. And that happens in groups. And so if you're trying to do this alone, that's not what is right. That's not what's healthy. And that's not what's recommended according to not just us, but God's word. Jesus did not send them out by themselves. He sent them out in groups. There was the 12 disciples, and all throughout scripture, even with Paul, he went with others. He imparted courage to others. Scripture gives us a plan and a ideal that we must be around others in order to develop this idea of courage in our lives. So we must get out of our comfort zones and be with other courageous men, fellowship with the courageous. Well, we really have enjoyed talking about courage today. And I think that we really want to encourage all of you guys that don't just sit where you're at. Make sure you step up to the plate and be courageous. Have courage. Pray. Courage prays. It doesn't sit where it's at. Courage pushes through things. It doesn't just sit where it's at. So let's step up to the plate as men and develop courage in our lives starting today, not tomorrow. Today, let's be men of courage.
So I got a parting shot, Stephen. Here's a quote from a guy called Belcher, I think. Here's what he said. "If people were half as scared of offending God as they are of offending men, we would have a multitude of red-hot Christians." So we got to get over the fear of man, the fear of woman, the fear of everything, and have only a fear of God, and just go for broke, swing for the fence. Like God told Joshua, only be strong and courageous. I mean, what a task he had before him. And there was reason to fear, but God said, no, only be strong and very courageous and keep the commandments. And he led those people, those difficult people, by the way, he led them and he made it to the promised land. So I believe be strong and courageous is the watchword for today.
Well, remember to be locked in on our social media. Make sure you're following us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. That's how you can keep up to date with all of the news for the show. And make sure you're following along on YouTube and keeping up with all of our content. We have really put a lot of time into our YouTube channel. And thank you to all of you who have subscribed. That has been a real encouragement to us, but it's also just been a blessing to everyone else who gets the message because you're subscribing and passing it along. And if you have not passed this podcast along, could I encourage you to do that? Pass along to a friend, somebody at work, somebody maybe at your church, somebody in your small group, somewhere. Let them know. Follow at Man Talk Pod on YouTube, and they can listen to it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And that would be a great way to spread this to as many men as possible as we seek to promote biblical masculinity. Well, it's been great to be with you, and we'll see you right back here in the Man Talk studio next time for episode 7 of season 2. We'll see you then.